nanohub.org.
Online simulation and more for nanotechnology.
Okay, so I got interested in learning about 10 years ago. And it turns out there's a lot known. Some of it you'll see is 130 years old. They knew this ago. But no one ever told me. And I'm sure a lot of what I'll tell you, you have never heard before. Some of it you might. Okay, so what is learning? Well, it's creating these mental models in your mind. Okay, so a mental model is this mental representation of some physical entity. Okay, so, and these mental models, you can get them, keep building them and making them more and more sophisticated. So for instance, someone who's not an engineer sees this and they might have enough of a mental model to say it's some sort of electric circuit. Sophomore electrical engineering student taking some courses might have a mental model of how to solve it without understanding it. So they may know we have some resistors here in parallel. I know how to add them. And then I know how to do a voltage divider. But that might be the extent of it. So I'm teaching a junior level electric and magnetic fields course. And these students will have had 2 courses at least in circuit design. And I asked them, what is voltage? Tell me in one sentence what it means physically. And most of them can't do it, right? It's the amount of work to move 1 coulomb of charge from the negative terminal to the positive terminal, no matter what path you take, even outside of the voltage source. So your goal should be to get a better and better understanding, a more and more sophisticated model than just how can I work this problem to get a good grade on the exam? Because once you get out there in the real world, the more you understand something, the better you'll function as an engineer out there. Now, Charlie Munger talks about building a lattice-work of mental models to really get worldly wisdom. And so he's talking about, very different topics becoming or developing mental models in. So you can bring a lot of different things to bear on problems. So you can solve more sophisticated problems. You can be creative. That's what it takes to be creative. Connecting something over here with something over here that no one else has done before. So let me give you an example. So Claude Shannon was an undergraduate who majored in electrical engineering and mathematics. And like college students now have to do, you have to take gen ed courses. So he took a philosophy course. In that philosophy course, they talked about George Boole and Boolean logic. So Boole determined that you can solve logic problems by having these statements that are either true or false and doing this algebra he developed, Boolean algebra on them. So you're probably all familiar with this. So as an example of a logic problem, if I do my homework and my chores, I can go to the movies. So he stated that as an AND operation. So if you don't do your homework, you don't do your chores, no movie. Don't do your homework, do your chores, still no movie. The only time you go to the movie is if you do your homework and your chores, and that's an AND operation. So Claude Shannon went on to MIT, working on a master's, and he did a summer internship at Bell Labs. And he sees all these switching relay circuits, and back then people were designing them more like an art using intuition. And he thought, well, I can describe it as these switches are like ones and zeros in Boolean logic. So I can use Boolean logic to design these circuits and come up with even simpler circuits than the engineers at Bell Labs are coming up with. So he created digital logic design. by connecting these two mental models that he was the only one in the world at the time had in his head. Another example, I think, is Elon Musk. Okay, so he started to learn coding when he was 10 years old, got pretty good at it. I think he developed some video games he sold and so forth. So when he went off to college, you would think he'd go into computer science or computer engineering. No, he double majored in economics and physics. So he had all these mental models, and I think that probably played a key role in why he's able to develop companies like SpaceX and Tesla. So, you know, often you hear, well, we're going to work in teams, diverse teams, because we have all these mental models, and that's a good thing. But even then, you might not have all the mental models, even at companies like Johnson & Johnson, Procter & Gamble, or at NASA. So this website was set up, and companies like Procter & Gamble and NASA go to it when they have a problem that they can't solve with the talent they have in-house. And sometimes someone completely not related to that industry sees it and connects with something and solves the problem. 80% of those problems have been solved that way. And the companies, you know, will post the problem and say, you come back with a solution to me, you get $50,000. So you might want to look at it. Maybe you can solve some problems and make some money. Okay, so these mental models have to be stored in your memory, in long-term memory. So the first thing we have to talk about is memory. And we owe a lot about our understanding of memory to patient HM, as he was known until he died to protect his privacy. So Henry had severe epilepsy, and it wasn't responding to medication. So in 1953, they removed part of his hippocampus. It's a region in the brain, and I'll talk a lot more about it. The good news for Henry was his epilepsy got much better. The bad news for Henry and the great news for memory researchers is what it did to his memory. So Brenda Milner was one of those scientists who worked with Henry in the 1950s. So 1950s, right? So there's a picture of her in 2014 lecturing. She's like 102 and still works at McGill University. Okay, so to Henry, every day that Brenda went in there, he was meeting her for the first time. He could not put anything else in long-term memory. Okay, it's like the movie 50 First Dates, if you've ever seen that. Okay, so Drew Barrymore and Adam Sandler meet and fall in love. Sandler comes back the next day and Barrymore has no idea who he is. And they explain to him that she had an accident. She can't remember putting things in long-term memory anymore. So the gist of the movie is every day he has to get her to fall in love with him again. So every day that Brenda goes in, she has to reintroduce herself to Henry. So the hippocampus plays a role in putting things in long-term memory. But Henry remembered everything pre-surgery. You know, who his parents were, where he lived, who his friends were. So that's not where long-term memories are stored. Okay, we'll talk about this later, but during the day, when you're learning, things go in your hippocampus. When you sleep, two things happen. That information is transferred to your prefrontal cortex in long-term memory locations, and your hippocampus is erased, so the next day you're prepared to learn again. So I'll talk a lot more about sleep next week because it plays many roles, but here's the first key. Always get good sleep. The other thing Brenda discovered is that we have two memory systems, a conscious and a subconscious one. So the conscious one is for remembering things like facts, like what is the capital of Indiana? Or remembering an event like a birthday party you went to last month. The other one is a subconscious memory, a procedure memory. That's the things that you don't think of, but you've learned how to do, like ride a bike or type. So she discovered that Henry could still learn new procedures. So if he didn't know how to type, she could go in every day and say, Henry, can you type? And he says no, and she would work with him to teach him. 2 months later, Henry, can you type? No, type this. And he'd sit there and start typing and go, how am I doing this? I don't know how to do this, but he could do it. Yes. Okay, spaced versus masked. This relates to memory, very important thing to learn. This was an experiment study that Hermann Ebbinghaus did in the 1880s. So he created this list of words, nonsense syllables, 3 letters. The first and third were consonants, the middle one was a vowel, like wid, zoff, mott. And he took a set of these and he memorized them. Then he came back the second day to see how many he could recall, third day how many he could recall, and so forth. And he found that he was forgetting them exponentially with some time constant. So it might be like this curve here. So his next experiment was he took a set of these words and memorized them. He came back the next day to see how many he remembered. So he was down to here. Then he took that set and rememorized them. Then after rememorizing them, 1 day later, he saw how many he remembered, 2 days, 3 days. He found he was still forgetting them exponentially, but it was a longer time constant. So of course he did the third experiment, where after the second, he saw how many he didn't recall after the first time rememorizing them. He rememorized them again and found, again, forgetting them exponentially, but an even longer and longer time constant. The other important thing here is, let's say it takes 20 minutes to memorize those words. If Ebbinghaus spent 60 minutes here, the next day where would he be? Same place. But if he took those 60 minutes and did 20 this day, 20 this day, and 20 this day, he'd be much better off. So that's the first important key, is you want to space out your studying. You don't have to put more time in, just make sure you spread the time out. So if you have an exam next week, you start studying a little bit today and every day. You don't wait till the day before and you do this masked, blocked studying of 8 hours. Okay, so what is forgetting? Well, it could be one of two things. The actual memory could disappear, or the retrieval has gotten weaker and you can't get it retrieved. Well, it's now thought that if you really put something in memory, it's actually there forever. Okay, you have at least 80 billion neurons, each one making 1,000 connections. There's a lot of storage, more than enough storage space for your lifetime. And it's actually the retrieval that's a limit. And we probably evolved that way because, 30,000 years ago, it was more important to know recent things than things that happened years ago. For instance, where were the saber-toothed tigers yesterday? Not where were they a year ago. Did I find food yesterday? Not a year ago. And it's helpful for other reasons. First time I went and drove in the UK, went to Scotland, flew into Edinburgh Airport, rented a car. So this was the first time I'd be driving on the left side of the road and shifting with my left hand. Okay, so I come out of the airport And I also, for the first time, hit this massive roundabout that's like 5 lanes deep. So I pulled into it, and of course there's a lot of cars honking. And I was really glad I bought the extra car insurance, as long as I survived that. But within a day or two, I had completely forgot about the way I drive in the US, and it was just, you know, procedural memory, didn't even think about it, driving left-hand side of the road, shifting with the left hand. And you can easily think of situations like this where the memory's there, but you had trouble retrieving it. I encounter that a lot more because I'm much older than you. But if you think about it, let's say there was a friend in grade school and you're trying to recall their name. If I gave you a list of 4 names that had your friends on it and 3 names you never saw, you'd instantly know which was the one you were trying to retrieve. It was still there in your memory. So memory's the way to think about it. It's a lot like, say, lifting weights. If you want to get stronger, you don't go into the gym and lift weights for 8 hours. You're going to spread that 8 hours of lifting over a couple weeks. Same thing if you want to really entrench something in your memory and have good retrieval of what you're putting in your memory. And here's someone else who recognized this back in 1901, William James. Cramming seems to stamp things in by intense application before the ordeal, but a thing thus learned can form few associations. On the other hand, the same thing recurring on different days in different contexts, read, recited, referred to again and again, related to other things and reviewed, gets well wrought into the mental structure. So we'll see he's talking about a lot more than just memorizing something. The other thing we're going to see that this spacing does, it allows you to learn things more in depth, to connect them to other things that are already, these models already in your mind. So let's look at an experiment showing how this spaced learning works. So in this study, they took a bunch of undergraduates and they were going to teach them how to find permutations. So for instance, if you have these 6 letters, there's 60 different ways of writing those 6 letters. So at Purdue here as an undergrad, you'd learn how to do this in 302, probabilistic methods of signal analysis. Okay, so they taught them how to do that. And they broke them up into spacers and massers. So the massers is this doing it all at once, this big block of studying. And then tested half the spacers after 1 week, the other half after 4 weeks, and the same with the massers. So the spacers came in, they taught them how to do it, and they gave them 5 practice problems. So they had 45 seconds to do the practice problem, and then shown the solution for 15 seconds. They came back a week later and did 5 more problems. So half of them took a test a week later, scored a 70%. The other half took their test 4 weeks later and got 64%. So the masters come in, they learn the technique and do the same 10 problems, but all at one time. So a week later they test, they do a little bit better, 5 percentage points than the spacers. But 4 weeks later, just from that 1 extra spacing, the spacers retain twice as much of the material as the masters did. Here's another study with surgical residents who were being trained to do microsurgery. And at this particular hospital, the technique was to do these 4 short lessons all in 1 day. So that's going to be group 1. Then they took another group of their residents and they spaced each of the lessons by 1 week. So it took 4 weeks for them to do the 4 lessons. So then they came back, and a month later, after their last lesson, so the masters did it one day, 4 weeks later they did the test. The spacers learned for 4 weeks, and a month later did their test. The test was rat's aorta was severed, and they had to put it back together. So the blocked group performed worse on everything they test for. So how much time it took to reattach the aorta, the number of hand movements, number of rats that lived, than the spacers did. In fact, 16% of the rats were killed by the blockers. The spacers, all the rats lived. This surgical hospital immediately changed how they were teaching microsurgery. So if you ever have to have surgery, ask your surgeon, did you have block or spaced learning? Okay, where you study, turns out, has a big effect. So in this study, it was done in Scotland. They took 18 scuba divers and had them submerge 20 feet. And they memorized 36 words underwater. 1 hour later, 9 of them took a test on how many they could recall on land, and 9 did it when they were submerged. The submerged divers recalled 30% more of the words. So there were some cues from where they had studied them that somehow were helping in that retrieval process. Some sort of hooks from being underwater where they had learned memorized these words were helping them recall them. So here's another study about the environment of where someone studied. So group 1 studies in silence. Group 2 had a Mozart piece playing in the background, and they didn't know that that was the purpose of the study. They just thought there was some quiet music in the background. Group 2 was a jazz piece. Group 3 was with a Mozart piece. And a lot of these experiments revolve around memorizing words, but we'll look at some that don't. We already did the one with the permutations. Okay, so they studied those words, and then they tested them. Half of the jazz group they tested with the jazz music playing in the background. That group recalled almost 21 words. The other half of the jazz group, they played Mozart in the background. They only were able to recall about 11 words. The Mozart study group listening to Mozart during the test got a little over 18. The Mozart group listening to jazz got almost 13. Again, a lot less. So there was some cues from having that same music playing that helped them retrieve those words. And interesting, the silence was down at the bottom, like the Mozart jazz or jazz Mozart. And that's probably because of being in the silence, there was no additional cues to help them recall the words. Yes?
What's study time? Because I'm thinking that study in the jazz environment, they make you go out of mind or something like. The study time actually becomes longer, so
yeah.
Study time is uneven for different times.
Yeah, so you're saying that jazz is such like a chaotic sort of music compared to Mozart, that has some sort of effect? It could, because a general theme you'll see through this is that if you make your studying a little bit harder, you learn a little bit better and a little bit deeper. That's what the spacing kind of does. You forget, so it's a little bit harder and you have to rememorize. It's probably the same thing here to some extent. If there's some noise in the background, you have to work a little harder to concentrate, and maybe you learn the...
Concern is that means I also put more effort in learning. So the retreat
You think-
is better, but I also put more effort or cost in the time.
Okay, so you like jazz, so that would really jazz you up to study.
I personally like jazz.
Yeah.
But I cannot use that a lot.
Yeah. Yeah. And I'll show you another study that actually just background chaotic noise helps in the learning process. Mm-hmm. Okay, so here's a study, again, memorizing words, but had two groups, and group one was split, and let's see, they were studying 44 words, and they had 2 10-minute sessions to memorize them. So group one did both their study sessions in this dark, cluttered basement. Second half of group one did both their study sessions in this nice, spacious, bright room. And group two did one study session in each, one in the dark basement, one in the bright room. And then they were tested in a third room. So here's like the bright, spacious room, here's the cluttered basement. So the groups that studied both sessions in the bright, spacious room, or if they were both in the cluttered basement, did about the same. They recalled 16 words. Those who did one study session in the bright room and one in the basement recalled 24. So probably by studying in different places, they weren't so tied to the clues from the room that they actually studied in. Or maybe it provided a bunch of additional cues for them to recall this information. So the main point here is don't do all your studying in one place. You know, move around, study in your room, you know, go to the library and study, go to a coffee shop and doing some studying. And here at Purdue, undergraduates, many of them have exams that are in an evening in a room maybe they've never been in. I tell my class, well, why don't you go to that room and sit there and do some of your studying there, so there's cues from the room to help you when you actually take your exam. Okay, so this is basically what I just talked about, and there is actually a study that shows that if there is some background noise that makes it a little bit distracting, not enough that you can't study, but a little bit distracting, that it helps you learn better, because you're probably putting more effort into doing the concentration you need. And because of that study, there's actually a website you can go to and play different background coffee house noise. Okay, interleaving. And what this involves is that it takes this spacing to another level. So even though you might be, you know, studying a little of the subject today, a little tomorrow, a little the next day, it's still kind of blocked a little bit. So the idea here is you're interspersing other things. And that naturally happens if you're a college student, like an undergraduate, there are 5 courses, you're naturally interleaving things. So that's a good thing. But even in the same subject, it's good to interleave the things you're studying. So if you're studying circuits, you should, you know, do a nodal analysis problem, then a loop analysis, then some equivalent circuit or something. Because when you get to an exam, your exam is going to be mixed problems. So you have to identify, you know, what does it take to solve this particular problem. And the same thing when you go out after you leave school. you're going to have to be able to identify, well, what do I have, what mental models to bring to this particular problem. So probably the oldest study on this actually had to do with the procedure. So they had these 8-year-old kids, and they were going to learn a skill. The skill was they would kneel down and throw a beanbag to a bullseye 3 feet away, but they were blindfolded. So they'd look where the target was, put the blindfold down, and throw the beanbag. So one group did all their practice throwing at the bullseye 3 feet away. The other group never threw in practice at a bullseye 3 feet away. They practiced throwing to 2 feet, then 4 feet, then 2 feet, then 4 feet. When they had a competition, the group that won soundly was the group that had never thrown to a 3-foot target. So if you play basketball, don't practice your free throws from the free throw line. Go 2 feet in and shoot, 2 feet behind and shoot, mix it up. All right, so here's another study where they were trying to teach people how to identify who painted something. So you'd be shown a painting and have to identify, is this a Gauguin, Van Gogh, Monet, Lautrec, so forth. So one group, the way they had them study was, maybe they showed them 10 Van Goghs and they looked and studied those 10 Van Gogh paintings. Then they gave them 10 Gauguins and they looked at those 10 Gauguins, then 10 Monets and so forth. The other group were shown the same paintings, but they were shown maybe a Van Gogh, 2 Monet, a Lautrec, and so forth. So then later, when they tested them, the ones who were shown the paintings interleaved identified 65% of the paintings by who the artist was. The ones who did it with block only got 50% right. So clearly, interleaving was much better than the block learning. But when they asked all the students, what's the best study technique, even though they saw these results, 80% of them thought the block method was better. Okay, so here's another one where they were teaching these students how to find volumes of three-dimensional objects, like wedges, spheroids, half cones, so forth. So group one practiced the problems clustered by type. So they first did like all the spheroid problems, then all the wedge problems, and so forth. The second group practiced them intermixed. So they might be given a wedge problem, 2 half cones, a spherical cone, and 2 spheroids, and so forth. So they all practiced the same problems, just one was all blocked, one was interleaved. So this was a pretty dramatic result here. So the group that did the block studying scored 60% on the test. The ones who interleaved got 89%, almost 50% better. And that difference escalated with time. After 1 week, the blocked ones only got 20% right. The interleaved more than 3 times better at 63%. Okay. So interleaving is more probably how you would also encounter things on an exam. Okay, you have to identify, what is this problem I'm trying to solve? And also when you go out in life, it's interleaving is more like what you're going to encounter. So you think the block learning is better because you see this rapid learning at first, but you don't notice that you plateau. Whereas if you're interleaving, you greatly pass where you end up with the block learning. Okay, so preparation is when you're sitting down and working on something like a homework set, or you're writing a program, or you're writing a paper. And inevitably you get stuck and you can't figure out how to get beyond, how to get to the next step. So incubation is what happens when you kind of give up and get away from it. So you go and do something else. You take a nap, you go out and get some coffee, you go play a sport, walk in the woods, whatever. And then you come back, and often you'll find that you will have come up with an idea of something to try. And once I learned about this, I started to recognize that happening all the time, especially when I'd wake up in the morning. I'd have a thought on how to proceed or an answer to something. And again, this was known in the 19th century because Hermann von Helmholtz said, "Happy ideas come unexpectedly, without effort, like an inspiration. So far as I am concerned, they never come to me when my mind was fatigued or when I was at my working table. They came particularly readily during the slow ascent of a wooded hill on a sunny day." And Wallas laid out these stages back in The Art of Thought in 1926. You know, this preparation is the time you spend at your desk trying to figure out how to do something. Incubation happens later when this is in the back of your mind and you don't think you're thinking about it, but your brain is actually working on it. And sometimes it comes as an all of a sudden pops in your mind. Other times it's just when you sit down and look at the problem again, you have, oh, I can try this now and see if that works. And you've probably all experienced this. Have you ever taken an exam and there's a problem you just can't do? And then a couple hours after the exam, when you're not even thinking about it, it comes to you how to work that problem. I know that happened to me. So let me give you a couple problems that will need to maybe incubate. You can think about maybe tomorrow when you wake up, you'll have a solution. I'll show you the solutions next week. So the first one here is moving 3 dimes to form a triangle pointing down. Now, I woke up and had a solution to this. It wasn't the solution they were looking for, but I'll show you both solutions next week. This one's actually easy and you might come up with it. This equation contains 3 errors. And this one, you have these 9 dots and you need to form 4 continuous lines. That means draw with your pencil without lifting the pencil and connecting all 9 dots. So this really works great when you're working on very large projects. So, which you're going to encounter as graduate students. You know, you might be doing research, which is a very large project, may take years. So you might have to put together a presentation on your work. You might have to write a paper. You might have to involve making a real big code to do something. So you want to start right away so you can do a little every day. So you're putting in this spaced learning, and you're giving, that's the other power of the spaced learning, is that you give yourself all these incubation periods. So you have, for the full duration of when you start the project to when you finish it, you're incorporating all this incubation time. Okay, deliberate practice. Okay, so Anders Ericsson spent his years studying what makes people experts, no matter what the field, whether it's chess, doctors, in sports, mathematicians. He wanted to know, what is it that made them experts? And I'll give you the bottom line here. In then talk more about it. It's the right sort of practice, which he calls deliberate practice, carried out over a sufficient period of time that leads to improvement, nothing else. So when he was a postdoc at Carnegie Mellon, and he hired this undergraduate, Steve Faloon, and he wanted to see if there's a way to improve short-term memory. You can remember about 6 or 7 digits if I read off random digits. 8, probably none of you would get it. Definitely not 10 or 12. So Steve would come in 3 times a week. Anderson would start and say 1562. Steve would go 1562. Then Anderson would add a digit until Steve missed, and then he would bump it down 2 and start over. So 2 weeks went by. Steve hadn't gotten any better. And he was pretty frustrated. But as we'll see, Steve had something called grit, which is a term that Angela Duckworth, a psychologist at Penn, uses and talks about, and we'll talk about that next time. So probably one time there were 3 digits like 431, and Steve recognized that's my best time in a mile. It turns out Steve was a long distance runner. So that time he got 10 digits right because he didn't have to remember 431. He, memorized the next 7 digits and he had 10. So he goes, I have a technique now. So he did deliberate practice. He didn't just keep repeating digits. He was looking for sequences and relating them to something. So he related them to a lot to things in running. Okay, and then, so if he could relate 3 digits to different things, all of a sudden he got up to in the 20s for remembering digits. And so he kept doing that, building different hierarchies for remembering things. And he got to 82 digits was his best. And back then, there were no memory competitions and things, so he was kind of a minor celebrity, would appear on some TV shows and things. So here's another example where deliberate practice leads to expertise, and that's in chess. So in this experiment, Chase, I think Anders Ericsson was a postdoc of Chase's at Carnegie Mellon. He took groups of chess players, some at the national level, some mid-range ability, and some novices. And he showed them a board with pieces on it. And the pieces were in one of 2 ways. It was either in the middle of an actual game, or they were just put down there randomly. And they had like 2 seconds to look at the chessboard, and then were asked to put the pieces where they were on the chessboard. So how many did they remember? For the most part, the national level players knew where all the pieces were, if they were in the position of an actual game. If they were just put there randomly, they'd get like 2 right. The mid-level players would get about half right, the novices about 4. So the national players have developed mental models that they weren't seeing chess pieces. They were seeing something that was occurring in a game, an attack, a defense, and whatever. And they didn't get there by just playing games. They did, as Anderson discovered, very deliberate practice. So they would study games by other chess players. When they lost a game, they would study what they did, what their opponent did. So they were doing deliberate practice. Okay, so let me give you an example where you have some mental models and can do this kind of chunking to remember things. So I'm going to show you a list of words and give you a few seconds to memorize it, and then think about how many of them you could recall. And also, if a word occurred more than once, how many times did it occur? You think you could get all those words? Okay, let me show you again. So you got them all right. It was the best of times, it was the worst of times, it was the age of wisdom, it was the age of foolishness. Those words mean something to you. They're not just words, they're something larger than that. Or you might recognize it as part of the first line of the novel A Tale of Two Cities. Okay, so another very powerful thing in learning is testing. Okay, so when I say test, you're all thinking of assessment, and that's what most faculty, most students think of. But testing is a very, very powerful learning technique. Okay, so first of all, it is a retrieval exercise. It is interleaving because you have different problems on different topics in the subject you're studying. As you're working on these problems, you're probably forming connections with the things you've been studying. Frequent testing keeps you on task. You figure out things you don't know that you need to look at more. So here's a study by Rodiger and Karpicki. Karpicki's a faculty member here at Purdue. Rodiger used to be here. He's at Washington University now. And they took a group of 120 undergraduates and had them study two scientific passages, one on the sun and one on otters. So the first group studied the two passages, and they had 2 7-minute times with each passage to look at it and read it. The second group could look at the passage for 7 minutes, but the second 7-minute segment, they sat and wrote down, recalling everything they could from their first reading. And then they were split into 3 groups, tested 5 minutes later, 2 days, and a week later. So let's see how they did. So 5 minutes after the second 7-minute session, the ones who got to study the passage twice did better than the ones who only got to study it once and then had to do a recall test on themselves. But it wasn't that different. It was, maybe 6 percentage points. Very different 2 days later. The ones who studied and then did the recall instead of study, did much better, and a week later, that looks like they're almost 3 times better. So testing isn't studying, it's much greater than studying. So you should always be self-testing. So tonight, you might say you had a class today. Pull out a piece of paper and a pencil and try to recall as much as you can from the class today. Tomorrow, when you're walking to a class, think about what was done in the class last time and try to recall what was talked about. When you're getting ready for an exam, sit down with a blank paper and see how much you can recreate of all the topics that are going to be on the upcoming exam. Okay, so let me tell you how not to study. Don't just keep rereading your textbook and rereading your notes. If you're working on a problem and you can't solve it, don't then glance at the solution. allow incubation to happen. You know, come back to the problem the next day. If you then come back to it and able to solve it, you've really learned it then. If you glance at the solution, you probably forgot by the next day. Don't do math studying. Don't wait till the night before, stay up all night studying and going in to take a test. Anders Ericsson calls this naive practice. Okay, so let me give you an example. So I often, doing this rereading your notes and things, you think you know the material, but you've only have a familiarity with it. I often have a student come in and say, oh, I really knew the material, but I failed the exam. I don't understand it. And when I asked them how they study, they just kept going over their notes or kept rereading things. So they were real familiar with the material, but they didn't understand it. They didn't know how to work problems. And let me give you an example. You've probably all seen the Apple logo 100,000 times, right? You're very familiar with the Apple logo. But which one is it? Okay. So how to study? Okay, so approach studying as a way to learn the material, to understand the concepts, to build these in-depth mental models, not how to get a grade. You don't want to, oh, what is the procedure to get the answer? You know, I have a lot of my undergraduate students, they'll come in to office hours and they'll ask me about a problem they can't work. And I start to explain something to them, and some of them will stop me and say, I just want to know how to work the problem. And I say, if you understand, then you'll know how to work the problem. You'll know how to work the problem if I change the variables or the wording of it a little bit differently. Okay, so you don't want to also keep rereading your text and your notes. Of course, you have to look at it to get familiar with the material. You want to space your learning. Okay, so you want to always be doing a little bit for each of the topics you're studying every day or every couple days. You want to vary where you study. You don't want it all to be in one location, so that location has all the cues for your memory retrieval. You want to interleave the topics and subjects you're studying. Okay, so it's harder at first, but then it makes you able to recognize a problem when you see it, what mental model to bring to bear on that problem. You do want to work a lot of problems, especially in engineering and science. So again, though, when you're working a problem, if you can't solve it, don't immediately ask for help. Don't immediately look to the solutions. Let it incubate. And you'll be surprised how many times that leads to you being able to answer the problem. Here's one I didn't mention yet, but explain material to someone or explain it to yourself out loud. I saw this one study where they had students working problems. One group worked them in silence. The other one, they asked them to verbalize every step. The ones who verbalized every step got many more of the problems right than the other group. And I think I've seen this before. When I was a freshman, there were a group of us all in calculus. And we used to get together to study, and I would always be explaining how to work things to everyone. They would do much worse on the exam than me, because I think I was learning a lot by explaining it to them. Okay. And as I've mentioned, testing is powerful. So if you have several previous exams, say, in a course, start about a week before, take one of the exams and try to work it under identical conditions. Okay, if it's 60 minutes, sit there for 60 minutes, close book for the whole thing, even if you feel like you're only getting 20% of it right. Don't look for other resources or help. Come back to it the next day. See if you can answer any of those additional problems. If not, then start to look at your materials to try to figure out how to work them. If that doesn't work, then look at the solutions. And after you've gone through that very deliberate process, take the second exam and do the same thing. 60 minutes, take the exam, put it away, come back the next day and try to work the ones you couldn't figure out the day before. So if you do that for 4 exams over a week, you're probably going to really learn the material. Also, if you run out of exams, if you can actually sit down and write an exam, think of the types of problems that could be asked, then you know you really have learned the material. And this testing effect, again, something not new, been well known. 1939, achievement tests or examinations are learning devices and should not be considered only as tools for measuring achievement of pupils. Okay, so here's a survey that was done at Washington University, again by Karpicki and Rodiger. And they listed 11 study techniques. And they asked these 177 undergraduates which techniques did they use studying for an exam and which one did they use the most. So 55% said rereading notes in their book. As now we know that that's not the best way of studying. Practice recall and self-testing. Number one technique for 1%, only 10% of the students use it. And that's probably one of the most powerful learning tools you can use. Do practice problems. Okay, that's about 12%. But again, that's a very powerful learning technique. Yes?
What I've heard so far is more like some sort of introduction to psychology. But what are all these connected to something like a learning algorithm or something in like PSYC?
Well, those things have to go into your long-term memory, right?
Yeah, somehow.
And somehow, if you're not understanding something, letting it incubate so that...
What's an incubation for? Is it something like right now?
Your mind... We'll get to a lot of it when we talk about sleep, because a lot of it goes on in your brain when you're sleeping. And your mind really gets more wide open, looking at things and trying to find the connection that's going to solve the problem you're working on during incubation.
Yeah, but computers don't sleep. But so I had heard
if you don't sleep, you will die. Did you know that?
Computers don't sleep. Computers don't sleep.
But what does that have to do with your learning, that computers don't sleep?
I mean, if I want to apply something I learned from like human to something like a learning for the computer, so how can I connect, for example, sleep to, I don't know, something in computer?
Well, I guess I don't understand because, yeah, computers don't sleep, but we're not talking about computers learning. We're talking about you learning.
But
right?
I want to find something like an inspiration between the two. Otherwise, I feel like I'm kind of learning like psychology.
Well, learning has a lot to do with psychology. If you think we're talking a lot about psychology this week, wait till next week. Because your mindset has a lot to do with how well you perform, how well you learn. Your self-control, your grit plays a very big role in your success. Yeah.
Professor.
Yes?
I believe the question was related to machine learning. You're saying that these help very well with learning from a human perspective.
Right.
But if he's trying to design a machine learning algorithm,
Oh.
how can he incorporate these strategies
Oh.
to help a computer learn better.
Okay, thank you. I didn't catch your question correctly. Sorry. I don't know, because I'm more of a physicist, so I don't know anything about machine learning. So I don't have that mental model. You have that mental model. Maybe with these mental models, you'll make a breakthrough in machine learning. That's what I'm trying to convey to you. Another thing, when you are reading, it turns out that the way you should read is spend most of your time, like it's found that it should be about 60% of your time, looking up and recalling what you've been reading. In fact, that was known back in 1917, but it's just recently that there's been studies about how much of this time you should spend doing this recall. And I know it probably varies with subject a little bit and from person to person, but clearly if you're probably spending, 30-40% actually stopping and trying to recall what you've been reading, it will strengthen that material for you. Okay, so study groups. I think, and from what I'm reading, a lot of learning is very individual, but it does help to get together with others just to make sure that, you're not misthinking something, to maybe catch errors. If there's errors in textbooks, faculty members make errors. So getting together in groups are a way to catch that. But again, start out doing a lot of your studying alone. And if you're in these groups, if you're the one explaining things, you're the one doing most of the learning. Okay, so also take advantage of office hours. I often have a student who'll come in and they're really struggling, but it's really just one little thing they're missing. And it doesn't take long to figure that out, and you see the light come on and they leave my office with a big smile. That's really a satisfying feeling for me. So, take advantage of office hours. A goal should be try to get one professor a semester to know who you are. Now this is especially important when I tell our undergraduates here, because they have these classes with 80 students and time to graduate, not a single professor knows who they are, and they need references or recommendations. So I tell them, go into office hours, if for no other reason, even if you don't need the help, to get the faculty member to know you. So you have someone to ask to be a reference. And, there's always a chance of a benefit of a doubt when a grade cutoff is being put in. Okay, learning styles. You all probably heard this. It's kind of dogma, but it's a total myth. There is no proof that someone has a preferred learning style. It is known that the more senses you come to bear during your studying, the more you'll learn. Just think back to the, music in the background. So if you can bring in sight, hearing, touch, taking notes is important. It brings in the sense of touch and helps. Even smell would work if you could somehow figure out how to incorporate it, because I'm sure you've all had that experience. There's some scent you smell and it retrieves a memory. You hear a song on the radio, it retrieves a memory from when you were 14 maybe, from that song. Let me skip a few things here because we're running out of time. I just want to do one more thing here. Okay, so here was a study at the University of Michigan where every student had a monitor so they could see the PowerPoint. The faculty member could ask questions that the students could answer. The students could post questions or indicate they're being confused, and they could take notes. So there was a record of the notes they were taking or how much volume of the notes they were taking. So, interesting result. I want to focus on just the note taking. So the students who were taking like 60% more notes than the class average were scoring greater than 90 on the exam. Those who were taking 25% less notes were scoring in the 70 to 80 point range. And probably more telling is looking at the students' GPAs coming into that class. So this had nothing to do with their performance in the class, but it showed past performance and past behavior. So the students coming in who had greater than a 3.5 GPA took 4 times as many notes as the students coming in with the GPA under 3. And that probably had a lot to do with helps them pay attention. It gets the sense of touch involved. And if you're going to be taking notes, I also recommend don't do it on a keyboard. There's been studies that show learning is much better if you're taking the notes with pencil and paper than just typing on a keyboard. And, you know, hands were made for learning. So as a hunter-gatherer, you could tell if a fruit was ripe by its touch, if something would make a good weapon by its touch, and so forth.
Like iPad or something like that.
Well, writing on an iPad? Yeah, writing on the iPad is probably, you know, it's more feel and sense of touch. Yeah, that's probably equivalent to pencil on paper. Yeah. Okay, so just kind of quick summary. So you want to space your studying out instead of doing this block cramming. Interleave topics and subjects. Move around when you study. Go to different places. By spacing, it gives you this opportunity to have things incubate. You want to do deliberate practice, explain things out loud, and take lots of notes. Okay, so next time, you know, the human brain is 2% of your body weight, but it uses 20% of the oxygen you breathe and 20% of the glucose in your blood. So things that are good for your body are good for your brain. So next time we'll talk about sleep, exercise, and nutrition, which are all good things for functioning of your brain, and some other psychology things related to mindset and grit. So I'll see you next week.